Hello all, good evening. Welcome to the 103rd monthly film screening at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, IIHS. We've been doing monthly screenings for the past 8 years, and this would be the 103rd screening. And this month, we are going to be screening Cyclotron by Jahnavi Phalkey. It's a pleasure to have Jahnavi with us today, along with the editor of the film, Tanya Singh, who will be in conversation about the film and many more things with Aromar Revi, who's the director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. Before I hand over and we move into the discussion, I'm going to briefly introduce the film and our speakers today. Cyclotron is about the world's oldest functional particle accelerator and people who keep it running even today. It was operational in 1936 at the University of Rochester, United States, and was built merely 3 years after the very first cyclotron was built by Ernest Lawrence at Berkeley. What the film does now, many years later, it explores the life and legacy of the machine, as well as the struggles and triumphs of its technicians, researchers, and students. It is a comment on the stage of experimental research and higher education on Indian universities, and we will be discussing, this will be the thread of conversation today for the next 1 hour. A brief introduction to Jahnavi. Jahnavi was appointed founding director of Science Gallery, Bengaluru in November 2018. Formerly at King's College London, Jahnavi is the author of Atomic State, Big Science in the 20th Century India, and has co-edited Science of Giants, China and India in the 20th Century. Jahnavi read Civics and Politics at University of Bombay and at SOAS London. She holds a doctoral degree in History of Science and Technology from the Georgia Institute of Technology, Atlanta. And this is Jahnavi's first film, and I am sure she'll make many more films. So congratulations, Jahnavi, on your first film. Tanya Singh, who's the editor, is also able to join us, which is lovely. This is something we do at every film screening, is we try and have the director and people who worked on the film. So Tanya is the editor of the film. Tanya makes films and theater in London. She's currently writing a history of experimental film practices in Western India, exploring the infrastructural legacies of colonial rule. Entangled and global histories of policing, surveillance, and counterinsurgency are a recurring concern in her work. She was born in Chandigarh. They're both going to be in conversation with Aromar Revi, who many of you know is the founding director of IIHS. He is an alumnus of IIT Delhi and the Law and Management Schools of the University of Delhi. He's a global practice and thought leader and educator with 35 years of interdisciplinary experience in sustainable development, public policy and governance, human settlements, global environmental and technological change. Thank you all so much. So Aromar, if I may hand it over to you and we can start the discussion.
Thanks. It's a real pleasure to have Jahnavi and Tanya here. I mean, you know, I saw this film a few months ago, and it was interesting. It was fascinating in some senses. And I was just talking to Jahnavi about the fact that, you know, to find these kind of facilities that are running and the people behind it is surprising, especially because they were set up 90 years ago. And in some senses, when they established this at the height of sort of the research that was being done around nuclear physics at that point of time, they would never have imagined that it's not only running 90 years later, but is actually being used actively for research. So I think it's fascinating that as a historian of science, you were able to, you know, get out, find this thing. You were able to find a film editor who comes from the city of Chandigarh. In some senses, you're sort of helping us relive and sort of re-examine the nature of how both science and in some senses technology have been sort of played out in India over the last many years. But I guess, you know, if you could just open up, I picked a few clips from the film that I found quite interesting. And we'll sort of play them very quickly. They're all less than a minute each. And then maybe, you know, if you can reflect on them. I have a few questions because, you know, this is a very gritty film in some senses. It's not the kind of fancy stuff. I just saw something from CERN today that's wonderful. It's in, augmented reality, and you can step into the Big Bang and stuff like this. But this is the nitty-grittiness of everyday science, and the fact that you can keep things running maybe 60 or 100 years after they were actually set up. So if we can have the first clip.
This machine, I was told, was first put in operation before World War II. This will be the oldest cyclotron in the world, working for 30 years second time.
So, Jahnavi, I mean, this is fascinating in some senses. There you see, and you've sort of brought together, historical footage, and atoms for peace, and things that are kind of almost forgotten at the current point of time here. So you have Oppenheimer, and you have, Lawrence there, and I think you've met Fulbright
Yes.
personally. So I mean, what reflections would you have as a curator of sort of a leading science gallery, in this part of the world at least? How does one sort of link this, and how does one see the progression of this sort of fascinating technology and how it's being used in India now, almost 90 years since it was actually built?
Yeah. So, thank you, Aro. So thanks also for your kind words to begin with. So I think the first thing I would like to state is that this is not an unmodern machine, right? Like, even if it's an old machine, it's like looking at an old wheel or an old wrench or an old screwdriver, right? It's not an unmodern machine in that sense, because machines at this energy are today used in hospitals, in museums, and in other places to do, other kinds of work. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, it's dwarfed by the scale of, say, a CERN, which is, which has a radius of 2 kilometers. And this is not quite that machine. This is baby CERN in that sense. So it cannot do, for example, cutting edge work in nuclear physics research of the kind that the world has gotten used to. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that it is not useful for some things that it was useful for in the 1930s, and it continues to be used, for those kinds of things also in Chandigarh, right? So I think that's the first thing I would like to state, because often I've gotten, I have got questions of the kind where, this is sort of a throwaway thing. This is sort of, not particularly, I know you're not saying that, because you know these machines. I mean, given your own training. Mm-hmm. But that's among the first, among the first things that I hear from people. So, I'm standing here today, I'm a historian of science. So, I'm used to, not only used to, but I am driven by wanting to look for old things, right? And so to very quickly summarize, I mean, those of you who have heard me talk about the film the one or two times that I've done so far, you've heard me say this sad story of mine, which is that, this was supposed to be a chapter in my doctoral thesis on the beginnings of experimental nuclear physics in India. And then I found enough research material to actually write a thesis, using just 3 of the 6 labs that I studied. And so I then ended up, with research on 3 others, which I didn't quite know what to do. The regular thing would have been to write a paper. I decided not to, and decided to instead make a film.
That's brilliant.
So, thank you. And, so in a sense, it even when I think, so you asked me what does someone who's today establishing a science gallery, which is, more or less future facing, because we are not a collections-based space, think about something from the deep past, in a sense, right? And quite frankly, I mean, my own thinking about the gallery goes, even further in the past. So for me, the starting point for the science gallery in the immediate past is, in fact, the early 20th century, which is the Indian Association for Cultivation of Science, where, which was a public laboratory, not only for lectures like the Royal Institution in England, for example, but also had facilities where someone like Raman, who was an accountant, could actually go and practice high-end physics, so to speak, with equipment for over a period of 10 years before he joined the University of Calcutta. Right. And if I went even deeper into the past, then my thinking on the gallery is actually informed by natural philosophy. Before disciplines became dominant and we stopped asking big questions and we started asking, more and more detailed minutiae. And narrower. So not to devalue any, but I think in a way for science, for what I like to call an interesting cultural conversation around science to thrive and develop, we need to reach meaningfully into the past, and we need to also rethink what makes science in a way relevant, what makes the enterprise relevant to everyday life. And it's the everydayness of science that I'm interested in, which is also, of course, reflected in the film.
Yeah, which comes out so nicely in the film. I mean, the thing as a technologist is you see these are DC machines.
Yes.
To find a DC machine functioning in India is possible in some places, but I mean, it's wonderful to see that. And then you have valves, most people would not know what a valve is. Unfortunately, I do a little bit, but to see the valves, and these valves, to build a valve like this before would be a research project in some sense, a huge one.
Correct.
You may not even manage it, if you were to, bespoke try and build valves like this and rebuild them. So that's a fascinating thing, how we managed to keep this culture together for so many years. And, if this valve breaks down, that's the end of that story in some sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's what, so cyclotrons are not easy things to build, right? They're not easy things to build.
What they've done. It's like great art for them to be able to, orient the beam, and then the beam, you can hear that in the film all over the place. So, just managing that. And anyway, we'll come to that a little bit. Just a quick question there for Tanya, you come from Chandigarh. This is kind of an interesting sort of harking back from maybe where you came from. But this film has been edited in a very sort of interesting way, keeping in mind, the range of things that you're dealing with. You're trying to kind of reach out to a general audience, but even people who are in the physics space, and I can see a few people who are on the call are interested in it. How did you kind of balance these kind of range of materials that were there?
So first of all, I'm not from a science background, so the process of making the film was also a process of me understanding the machine, me understanding the science, me understanding the chronology of this history as well. I before meeting Jahnavi, I knew absolutely nothing about atomic science research in India. So the process of learning through asking questions of Jahnavi, trying to piece to, well, firstly, it was trying to piece together the chronology of this particular cyclotron. But on top of that, there was the layer of me actually trying to understand what the hell is going on, right? So I am in some ways, I'm the audience who needs to have all of this explained to them. So I think that really helped, that I wasn't a specialist, that I didn't take certain forms of knowledge and context for granted. So I don't know, I mean, through the process of making the film, I did come to understand a lot of the details. So maybe I lost some of that initial naivety. I don't know, maybe someone who's coming to this material for the first time might find that it is a very specialist film. But I can certainly say that I was learning. And I think the process of constructing the film was, I guess, a way of trying to translate what was my learning process into the form of the film. And then, in terms of my background in Chandigarh, I think that was quite important to being drawn to the project, but also perhaps in the types of questions that I asked of Jahnavi, perhaps. And so I had a very happy early childhood in fact, on the Panjab University campus. My parents are academics, so
how nice! Yeah,
this is where I spent.
Not so far from the cyclotron. That's in a
not very far at all. And in fact, I talked to my parents about it, and my dad would say, "Oh yeah, I knew there was a cyclotron there. I didn't really know very much about it, but I was always aware. I think I remember some of the people, So there was that kind of personal connection. There was also the fact that the period of time in which I grew up in Punjab was also, it was after 84. So it was the period of the insurgency. So I think that we only kind of tangentially touch upon this in the film. The story about the second or the largest cyclotron being moved to Delhi because of sort of political things going on. So I mean, maybe we can talk about this a bit later, but if a different film that would have been made, I would have been really interested to explore those wider contexts. But I also came to respect, through the process of working with Jahnavi, the importance of not leaping to the big story straight away, to the big grand narratives and the geopolitical questions, which I think are the things that, if you're not already engaged in science work, you think are more interesting, right? Like the world scale stuff. And actually I came to appreciate that we needed to stay with this small lab, and we needed to stay with the everyday difficulties of working in this lab, and the complexities of the work they were doing, the smallness of it. I hope that answers your question.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's the interesting thing about it. It shows us how complex and how determined by external circumstances, and the sheer, I would say, perseverance of the team that has helped build and manage this thing over so many decades. So there are lots of accidents happening on the outside, and that defines what's happening. But I think what you're saying is very interesting, and in some ways, not having a background in science is very useful, because in a sense that's a test of good science. If you can't explain it very simply, and you've sort of constructed that narrative, very interestingly in the film, then the science in some senses has limited value if it's only for scientists who are trying to do this kind of stuff. To build on that, maybe if we can run the second clip, we can sort of try and explain or sort of examine the kind of questions that I was trying to raise earlier. So if you can just play the second clip for a second, please.
Today's situation is that we have two tubes, and you will not find this tube anywhere in the world. There is no company enough. You take care of your child. So we have to take care of like that. Till these two tubes are there, this machine will run. But there is the life of every equipment.
So what I found very interesting there is a metaphor, you're in a sense bringing biological metaphors and metaphors of that machine together. And we often think of machines as something that would last forever. So we touch on this question, Jahnavi. I mean, those RCA tubes, when I saw them there's kind of very compelling images as far as I'm concerned. But in practice, when you're setting up these kind of facilities, or let's say the gallery that's looking back to look forward, how would you try and integrate these kind of things so that they're actually working? People will believe that it's not something that's just an artifact that's dead. How does one treat this kind of thing? How would one conserve these kind of resources? If you got the cyclotron to come to the science gallery, next year, and it became part of your exhibit, would you be able to keep it running? What would be, how would you treat it?
So there's no way to collect something like this, right? Like, I mean, if you go to the Science Museum in London, or if you go to, I think, the Berkeley cyclotron was at the Smithsonian and has now moved to Yale. They're going to open the exhibit next year. So, parts survive, right? Like, for example, the very first Cockcroft-Walton machine from the Cavendish, which is at the Science Museum, parts of it, the spectacular parts of it are kept. So I can imagine, parts of this will be kept in a museum. Well, we don't really have a museum in this country, a collections-based historical museum. So I have no idea what will happen once the cyclotron is no longer a functioning instrument, but has to be made a part of a heritage. So it'll be part. It won't be kept running, and that has its own challenges, right? Like, because museums have sterile objects in many ways. They are decontextualized. There is no grease, as you said. There's no noise. It doesn't work. So there's no engineering. They become sculptures, right? Like and sculptures sort of, and then it's informed by a certain aesthetic to it. So how does one keep this alive? I mean, a film was one. I mean, my option was film. By the way, those tubes were photographed by Tanya. I mean, I went and filmed once, and I decided not to do any more filming, and and to make the most of what I had. And she's of course, apart from just saying that, she's been absolutely wonderful. She also, when she visited Chandigarh, in fact, for personal reasons, she went and met the people, she went and took photographs, and she brought back additional footage, which we then were able to use, because I went and shot like a historian. I came back with words. I came back with next to little B-roll, as it's called by filmmakers. And we struggle, but she struggled more with it. I'm grateful to her for many things, but this is one thing which I'm even more grateful to her for actually, she got involved, and she, to the extent where she actually went and then, did some of the filming herself, and, talked to the people, understood the place on her own initiative. And so finally, when the film got made, it was a story that was put together by the both of us. And I remember actually the most surprising moment to me was when we did what to me was totally not, what to me was alien, called a paper edit. And we took colorful Post-its and went back, and we had these transcribed footage notes which we worked with, and we both came back with approximately similar assumptions, but both our beginning and ending shots were the same. They both changed by the time the film was done, but when we started working, and that's when I knew, this is we're on the same page, and we can work together, and this is just going to be fabulous, which it was. So so coming to how do you keep it alive? I think the country needs a museum. That would be my first sort of big level answer, but the sort of more feasible answer is that these machines and their histories need to be also preserved in situ, because I think it's people in Punjab and people in Chandigarh who need to not only take pride in what was accomplished there, but also that the effort is recognized, because it makes more sense. It is more meaningful to the people around there, and so it would be great if a heritage center was built around the cyclotron. But and then there's the Calcutta cyclotron, which is under lock and key, India's first cyclotron,
That's a story of a lot of what we see, and in fact, in some senses, our historical kind of orientation is rather poor, to say the least. So just to pick up on what you were saying, so Tanya, actually, what you were saying, you being very modest. So in some senses, we can see your voice there. You've gone back, you've filmed, you've shot, you've tried to put together, a whole range of things here. There's a whole range of elements that there's footage. Historical stuff. We saw the stuff of Oppenheimer and Fulbright, etc. And there's stuff that you shot on a campus, which you've lived on, but you never actually visited the site. So in that sense, it's a very reflexive moment in some senses, returning back to a place that you lived in, but you never really saw the object that we're now filming. So how did you decide to, like Jahnavi was saying just now, both in the paper edit and you're now both the cinematographer and the editor, which is an interesting mix in some senses, of choosing what you did and kind of building this narrative so that it's simple, it's clear, and yet it does explore very subtly some of the larger sort of geopolitical and other questions, or even the historical questions that you're talking about, of the life that you saw on campus.
So I don't want to take credit for cinematography, really, because I didn't do the bulk of it. There are certain things that I did during what I would call a pickup shoot when I happened to be in Chandigarh, and I took some additional footage. And at that point, we had actually already constructed the bulk of the edit. So we knew that we knew what the story was, we knew what the content was, but there was something filmically that felt a little bit lacking. And some of that comes, that feeling that something was lacking it's a personal taste kind of thing. And I need stuff to be visual. Like this, I can't really listen to just people talking endlessly, unfortunately. So part of it came from that. And then I think we were also trying to think about the film visually and formally as well. So there are two types of images in the film. There's the footage, photographs and video footage of the site itself. And so when I went back, we wanted to get a little bit more of that. So we wanted to get, more shots of the tools that were used, the greasy rags, and sort of bits of equipment that are kind of partially dismantled. The courtyard, which has this incredibly loud water kind of, I'm sorry, I've actually forgotten what its exact purpose is, but I know something to do with temperature regulation in the middle. The sort of green, the campus itself, kind of leafy campus around. So the feeling of the space. So that was partly my aim in just taking photographs of the area. The other type of visual material in the film is, of course, the archival stuff, and a lot of it Jahnavi already had. So photographs of the individuals involved, which were from archives and from journals and various sources that Jahnavi had painstakingly collected all of this. I had also seen, and I think I showed you this, Jahnavi, if you remember, there was a film by the Otolith group called In the Year of Quiet Sun, which is an experimental film made up of postage stamps that were issued by various newly independent countries in Africa in the 60s. And it's a really evocative, suggestive film. And I had seen that around then, and probably we had found some stamps of atoms of peace. I don't know, the two things sort of cohered, and it seemed like it seemed conceptually appropriate to pick.
It's a nice motif. You pick it up also in that reflection on, when Dr. Hans goes off to Russia.
Yes, exactly. And it's the postage stamp is almost like it's a sort of epitome of like what gets commemorated, right?
And before email and before all this electronic stuff takes over our life.
Yes, exactly. So it's the visual form of commemoration in the postage stamp, the achievements of a nation and of individuals as well. The individuals that get selected to go on the postage stamp. And, Professor Hans is not going to get chosen to go on a postage stamp.
Maybe he should.
Maybe he should, and maybe the technicians in the lab should be in the postage stamp. So anyway, I as well as it being kind of, evocative of an era and just kind of suggestive, I think we felt that, conceptually it was an interesting contrast between these.
No, there are a whole range of different motifs which have, woven together very nicely. But it's a very gritty film in some senses. It's gritty in the sense that it engages with the everyday life of the researchers who are there, the people who've been there forever. If you can just turn to another clip, can we run the other clip and then we proceed with the narrative in some senses?
For the first time that we make the connection on that for the mechanical pump and push the button, it started working. So we don't know what is this happening inside. So I went to the library, brought a book. That book is still with me to study its process. So this open kiya. I opened it and we traced that diagram, and that vacuum system was there. From this, we complete wiring, this connection was made. Along with us, Mr. Bahadur, he tested all the TCS generator. All power supply were DC. That was beautiful, but now they have been gone. Otherwise, you said they are very old, 1936, made in USA.
Yeah, Jahnavi, this really struck me in some senses. This is the live example of, you have a black box, you don't know what's inside it, and then you're reconstructing what happens literally from scratch. This is, to my mind, I guess, science did happen in many parts of the world like this, in different places where it wasn't within quotes high science. But this, to my mind, is a sort of a remarkable example of Indian ingenuity, in reverse engineering. My question, of course, is, as you're trying to build this new facility, have we lost this ability just now? You met the people who've done this. They're all in their 70s or the 80s or the 90s. Yeah. In one end, it reflects in Jugaad. So, Punjab is full of that. You can see it on the roads. But this is also a very important part of science. It's not, all about large-scale simulations and fancy equipment and stuff like that.
Yep. Yeah. So, yes, I agree with you. It's lost, and it's lost for several reasons, right? Like if you look at the central sizes of the central workshops at your IITs or IISc or NCBS or wherever you go, right? Like the leading science institutions in the country, including universities, sizes of the workshops central workshops have nearly disappeared. Department-based workshops might exist, but they're much smaller. And, this is, it's indicative of the kind of questions we are allowing ourselves to ask. It's the kind of research we are now both comfortable with, but also want to do. And like they say in the film, you want to do an experiment, you go and do it with 100 people at CERN, right?
Yes, exactly.
So it's, but it's disappearing also because fundamentally, I think you yourself have wasted some years at an IIT. You know all about it. We never put in the same kind of money or dignity in the ITIs or the industrial training institutes, right? And I think for any country to industrialize, you need to have pumped the same kind of resources in both those places, because otherwise you're not going to have the kind of precision. You're not going to have personnel who are able to work with precision technologies or thinking precisely or doing research or keeping instruments running or building new things or doing the kind of thing, as you said, they have never seen a cyclotron in their life, and putting all those massive, number of wires in the right places in order for it to be able to work with walls and transistors at that point of time, not
Exactly.
with state, is, it's fantastic. It's their dedication. I
think it's a great sign of both science and art in some sense, because
absolutely,
unlike a transistor, if you blow a valve, that's it. You don't get the valve back again, and it's very easy to blow the valve in some senses. When you explain stuff. So, and the fact that he still has that book, I found that so interesting.
He never returned it.
Yes, he never returned the book because it's part of his life. It's what that is. I think this is the story of everyday science, which is kind of we kind of forget. And in a sense, starting from school science and school laboratories, this connection to actually the physical reality of being able to check out stuff and the materiality of doing these things. These are not abstract things that only sit in mathematical equations or simulations or all that kind of other stuff. Eventually, these things work. Photoelectric stuff is working in our everyday life. This is how we are actually managing things. So that is something that I think we are losing. And of course, I think maybe the IITs are partially responsible for this, but it's also, I think, it's also a deeper cultural thing, which hopefully we'll pick up later in the conversation. So can we have another clip where I'm going to quickly take you through, 4 or 5 more things, which for me were very exciting in the film.
A final committee sat down, and for the first time, for selection of a accelerator, Prime Minister sat down there, Mrs. Indira Gandhi.
सिस्टम बना और इंदिरा गांधी की डेथ के पहले ही वो साइन हुआ, जस्ट 1 day before, वो आपको पता होगा.
If she would not have been sitting there, we would not have the accelerator at Delhi.
Dr. Hans played a big role in the Delhi Peloton, and he was trying to get this machine to be in Chandigarh, but unfortunately the terrorism problems. Because of that, we were unsuccessful to get it here. But nuclear physics culture, experimental nuclear physics with the help of accelerator, of course, that is only because of this cyclotron.
क्योंकि यहाँ तो एक्सेलेरेटर का कल्चर रियली है. हम लोग इवन एनएससी का जो IUAC का है ना, उसका कम से कम नहीं तो 40-50% पंजाब यूनिवर्सिटी टाइम यूज़ करती है, जो दिल्ली वाला है. हाँ, तो हमारे यहाँ पे अभी बचा हुआ है, बचा के रखा हुआ है. एक्सेलेरेटर कल्चर कोई ना कोई किसी ना किसी वे से एक्सेलेरेटर से लिंक्ड है, चाहे वो हाई एनर्जी फिजिक्स का है, चाहे न्यूक्लियर फिजिक्स वाला है, चाहे मटेरियल साइंस वाला. Everybody somehow linked with the accelerator.
So I really found this interesting because you've been able to, we were just talking about how you build a narrative out of these elements. You've been able to, show how accidents of history. So there is a young researcher who goes and writes to somebody who has an old machine and he's willing to give them for free because at least at that point of time, science was, at least this kind of science was still fairly magnanimous. You wouldn't think of that kind of stuff happening today. This is what the IEA inspectors run all over the world trying to look for. This is whatever WMD kind of stuff in some senses. So that's one accident. And then, of course, he has the perseverance to bring it over, assemble it, and then try and use it for 30 years. And then when you're trying to go to this completely new generation, it effectively, of course, Mrs. Gandhi was a Minister of Science and Technology at that point of time. But effectively, it's the Prime Minister that decides whether the science is going to go forward by not. And, there was, in a sense, a historical accident which changed the nature of where it could be. So there's so much of it's almost like a Markov chain in some senses. You don't know where it's going to play itself out, how it's going to run in and do stuff. So, this mix of bureaucracy, of a whole range of historical accidents in some senses, and this deep perseverance, which has built this culture that's still alive, irrespective of whatever other theory and practices we've seen in the last, 50 or 60 years. So any reflections on that?
Yeah, so this is the bread and butter of the historian, right? Like we that's what we keep saying. So when social scientists come and tell us, path dependency and whatnot, we just look at them and say, dude, andalo, because contingency, right? I mean, historical contingency is so important. I mean, Professor Hans and his colleagues in Chandigarh had been working over several decades. Well, at least a few decades before they expected a bigger machine and a better machine to come to Chandigarh, and the Panjab crisis, so to speak, or insurgency, meant that the decision was taken otherwise. That instead the machine would go to Delhi, and this is not something anyone could have prepared for, in a sense, right? Like, I mean, you can only prepare yourself to be ready for a new opportunity, but then at the last minute, the opportunity goes elsewhere. And So I mean, this is. But I think what is also interesting to note is that for a decision of this kind that Mrs. Gandhi sits in for signing off on where an inter-university accelerator facility would be built, right? It's not. I mean, the earlier meeting when Homi Jahangir Bhabha was alive, that was in 1964, which was the first time that a discussion on where to place accelerators in India was sort of on the table, and the committee had recommended there would be 4, north, south, east, west, as usual.
Yes.
And then it dwindled down to 2, and then it became 1, and that's how things unfolded. But so you're absolutely right in that this is but I mean, the only place where I would sort of take a slight pause is at bureaucracy, because of course it is bureaucratized in a sense, right? Like so there's no doubt that there is a huge science administration bureaucracy behind this. But I think what we should also cautiously remember is that nuclear sciences at this time in history were questions of the state, whether we like it or not, and no matter where, right? No matter where. I mean, the Americans were the only ones with resources enough to pump money to do nuclear physics in universities.
Yes. But that is the Department of Energy, expansion in some sense.
Exactly. So the world over, nuclear sciences were conducted under state-run national laboratories. So it wasn't only in India that centralization was taken as an option. And I think this is something we always forget, right? And I mean, even in the US, the answers were Brookhaven and Argonne National Laboratories, where 9 to 10 universities came together to establish large facilities. And the European answer was CERN, where countries came together to establish. So what was, in many ways, so this is, I have this, my favorite sentence in while discussing this argument in my book is like, what was a country like India, a young republic like India, supposed to do?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So you had to, I mean, if you wanted to do experimental nuclear physics at any credible level, you needed tons of money, and the state was not going to let go of that research area. And so, it was inevitably going to be a centralized facility given the kind of resources that were available. And that actually then in turn makes the Chandigarh facility all the more interesting. Yes. Because it defies all of this.
Exactly.
Right? It defies all of this and goes and sets up a particle accelerator in a university outside of Department of Atomic Energy Control.
Yes, exactly.
And there's, that's again not a trivial thing, right? Like not only do they do it in a university, but they don't do it for the Department of Atomic Energy. They do it for learning. They do it for science. They do it for, techno science, or, I hate that term, but they do it for engineering and science, and I think that also makes this this effort actually very, very interesting to note.
Yeah, and very special. I mean, if the people didn't have the perseverance, this could have easily fallen apart and be, junked, and then it would be on somebody's sort of asset register forever, as you see in many IITs or even, in the Institute of Science and stuff like that.
Or the Calcutta cyclotron, right? Like,
yes, exactly.
We have a live example of that.
Yes.
Live as in it's under lock and key for several years.
Yeah, which is kind of tragic and interesting at the same. Can we have the next clip, please?
Then you are able to get the proper external beam in 1975.
We got the first beam in 1976.
78 में पहली बार बीम आई, 78 में आ गया तो 10 साल हो गए, तो 10 साल में बिल्डिंग बनना, पैसों का आना, साइक्लोट्रॉन को लगाना, ये करने में लगता ही है टाइम, और ये पहला एक्सपीरियंस था डिपार्टमेंट का इस तरह के heavy structure का.
Yeah, so I mean, this just speaks to what we were talking about just now. So you take it outside the mainstream atomic energy framework in some senses. You take it to a university which has its own challenges, and then it takes you 10 years to be able to set it up and get it running because the infrastructure is not in place, the building is not in place, etc. Yep. So in some senses, what does it tell us about? This is almost like a subaltern culture of science compared to what was happening at that point of time in TFR and Bach and places like that. So, any reflections, because your own research work has looked at a number of labs, it's looked at the development of this field in the country. What is the place of this? Does it have some value for us in looking at how innovation takes place, how it could take place in the current context?
Yeah. So I think I'll take a second question later because that's a big level question. I'll speak to cyclotrons.
Okay.
It was not self-evident that cyclotrons would work. Mm-hmm. The Göttingen cyclotron in Germany did not work. The Paris cyclotron, which they wanted to put horizontal as opposed to vertical, did not work. So I think that's something to remember. Cyclotrons are not, you put everything together, you turn the button on and it works, right? I mean, your vacuum might not be stable. Your beam might not come. Your beam might not come out of the, thing. It might out of its circular thingamy. It might not get focused. It might not hit your target. There are so many uncertainties along the way.
Yeah.
And, some major departments did not actually get cyclotrons working. So not only did these people get it working, but they got it working after reassembly.
Exactly.
So this is really, really important to remember. And so if they take 10 years, right? It's actually given that a building had to be built and you're working with a team that has never even seen a cyclotron in their life. I don't think it took them that long actually. And, comparing it to other labs in India, TIFR's was a bought machine, right? Like it was a fundograph that they bought basically to make, they wanted to start with the work. So, buying a machine was, they bought it from Philips Eindhoven. They got started, they moved, because again, there was that ambiguity between BARC and TIFR, right? Like, I mean, because Bhava was heading both institutions fed into each other. Exactly. So TIFR bought theirs. The Calcutta cyclotron took years and years and years to work. And the variable energy cyclotron in Calcutta, that also took years and years to work, right? They started to build from scratch, and they worked with shipbuilders and others, with steel welders and whatnot. Oh my God, like, I mean, incredible stories. But so taking 10 years to my mind was actually not that long, frankly speaking, given the circumstances and given also the other machines around them, and even especially given that Göttingen and Paris couldn't make it work.
That's a very important point, because in some senses, in today's environment, you're expecting innovation to happen almost, maybe that's because of the nature of how it's moving in with electronics and with, the life sciences and neuroscience and stuff like that. You're expecting innovation to work literally on a weekly or monthly basis. And actually it takes a long time to establish the culture, which I think is very special there. I mean, the physical apparatus and processes, the technology and the ability to manage it is one thing, but the culture of using this thing, like they said in the beginning, they were using it pretty much every day till all the people retired and now they're using it 9 to 5 because they have no other way of doing it. So I think that's a really interesting story, and it's maybe even interesting for people who are trying to do innovation today, because it takes time to do this stuff. It's hard. You can't build an industrial culture or even a post-industrial culture without building up on that. Can we have another clip, please?
आपका नाम बताइए. राजवीर कौर. राजवीर कौर.
आप पीएचडी कर लिया?
हाँ जी.
कितने साल हो गए?
4 years.
किसके साथ कर रही है?
डॉक्टर अशोक कुमार है. मैंने कुछ किए हैं वाटर सैंपल्स, मेडिसिन प्लांट, सॉइल, एरोसोल, ऑल टाइप्स ऑफ सैंपल्स. तो जैसे वाटर सैंपल्स हमने कलेक्ट किए थे, यहाँ बठिंडा रीजन में कैंसर की बड़ी प्रॉब्लम आ रही है पंजाब में ना, यूरेनियम एंड लेड पॉइजनिंग, ऑल दिस हैवी एलिमेंट्स जो टॉक्सिक एलिमेंट्स है. तो हम जो यहाँ पे टेक्निक है प्रोटोन इंड्यूस्ड एक्सरे एमिशन पिक्सी टेक्निक है, उससे वी कैन फाइंड द एलिमेंटल कंटेंट ऑफ इन द सैंपल्स. यूरेनियम में वैसे बठिंडा में तो ये कह रहे हैं कि मे बी जो आसपास की फैक्ट्रीज हैं, और अभी पूरा इतना तो अभी हमने मैम सर्वे किया नहीं, अभी तो जस्ट वी हैव कलेक्टेड सैंपल्स.
I really found this fascinating, because in some senses, when you're looking at your facility, you're trying to bring in Bangalore, and you're looking forward, the question that one has is that, you're doing something today for a particular purpose, but in some senses, because this is such a, flexible facility, and you build this whole culture of science around it, it can come up doing remarkable things. You see not only a subaltern sort of engagement with the university, but you see them addressing questions of that particular environment. And who would have imagined in Rochester in 1936 that there would be a woman doctoral scholar doing work on, on environmental challenges that come from heavy metals pollution in some parts of, let's say, what would have been rural Punjab at that point of time. So any sort of reflections on that, on how that's kind of built itself out, and these translation across geographies and cultures that you've so well kind of juxtaposed in the way that you've edited and cut that film.
Yeah. So, I'd love to also hear what Tanya has to say to this.
Exactly.
So some of the uses to which the cyclotron is now being put were known to people earlier, right? Like, so Lawrence's brother, for example, was a doctor, a medical doctor, right? And so among the first cyclotrons that Lawrence built in Berkeley, his brother was already using them for leukemia treatment. So to make isotopes and other things for radio treatment, right? Radiation treatment, for example. And interestingly, he applied for funding to the Tatas at that point of time, because the Tatas were among the few globally sort of, philanthropic institutions that were funding leukemia research. It was called the Lady Ratan Tata Leukemia Fund or something of that sort. Okay. It was named after Lady Ratan Tata. So, some of these uses were known right since the beginning. In fact, money for cyclotrons was argued for on precisely these grounds. So very few people in the early days, even in the 30s, argued for funding for the cyclotron on the basis of research in nuclear physics, even though it was before the atomic bomb, right? Mm-hmm. They argued for it for medical reasons. They argued for it for study of materials.
Science, yeah.
And so even Meghnad Saha's application to the Birla Trusts and to the Tata Trusts, to the Dorab Tata Trusts, which was incidentally the referee report for it, if there is one, was written by Jawaharlal Nehru while in prison.
Oh, really?
Saying this is so the Rockefellers came out with an issue where they discussed the medical uses of the cyclotron, right? And of course, based on the work of Lawrence's brother, among other people. And Saha uses that as an argument to convince Nehru to write to the Birlas and the Tatas to give him money for the Calcutta cyclotron. And then he sends that, Rockefeller volume as a sort of, look, this is important. This is going to sort of be useful for a range of things going forward. So what they use, like I said right at the start, it's not an unmodern machine.
Yes.
It's just not at the cutting edge of experimental nuclear physics right now, but it does a range of, other sort of very, very interesting things, including, looking for, uranium traces elsewhere. But yeah, Tanya, did you have some observations on that? I mean, I told the history part of it. I'm sure you have other things to say.
Yeah, so something I noticed listening to it again was thinking about the complex relationship that the cyclotron has to industry. So what are they researching at this point? They're researching the toxic and damaging effects of industry in the local area. And yet at the same time, they're dealing with the problems of a lack of industry to some extent, the inability to find the appropriate nuts and bolts to get the machine working, not having the right tools, not being able to source this material in the local market in the way that you would easily be able to do in Europe or the States. So I think that there's this sort of, the complexity of Indian development is very clear in a sort of microcosmic way in this moment. And I think this is something that one of the interviewees talks about at one point, that the chaotic perhaps way in which development is happening, and the cyclotron is functioning and trying to respond to that chaos to some extent. So yeah, those are my thoughts listening back to that clip.
Thanks. So just 2 more quick clips and then we can open to questions, and Subhashi will take over. So can we have the next clip, please?
Everybody cannot go abroad. After all, we have a lot of students. We have to train them here.
If there is no facility, then they are not attracted towards it. So the whole idea of creating these facilities at the university campus is so that the students, MSc students who are coming basically from the universities, they get attracted and they do the research work in this field.
Yeah, I mean, this to me spoke to the sort of political economy of universities and sort of research institutions in the country, and how they play itself out. And this comes out very clearly, maybe because you're a critical historian in some senses. But any sort of quick reflections on that? What does it tell us in terms of building like you said earlier, a wider base for science, for technology, and sort of carrying it forward without being captured as much of the science funds do by elite institutions, because we are in this mad rush to compete with somebody else's ways of measuring things.
Yep. I mean, we know for a fact that Indian universities are underfunded. There is no getting around that. Not only underfunded and under-resourced, but also they're not respected enough. They're not, they've been decimated beyond what places of learning ought to be. Ought to have something like this done to them, right? So, and we see that here to a significant extent also. And like Professor Govil said, you need to have interesting facilities and good equipment and good training in the universities, because if you don't, where are your students going to get the interest and the wonder around science from? Not everybody, as he says very rightly, can go abroad. So if you want to keep sending people abroad and then bringing them back and repeating those same things by establishing laboratories to serve techniques that someone has learned in somebody else's lab abroad, go ahead and do it, which is what we are doing for the most part. Of course, there are islands of good hope, but for the most part, this is what we are doing, even in big institutions, right? So if that has to change, then the universities need to be resourced and regulated in order to be able to do what they're supposed to do, which is to give a wide-ranging training in areas of science and the humanities, so human and natural sciences, engineering, art, architecture, everything, which are not necessarily fashionable. So you don't give sort of humongous amounts of money for IT and computer sciences when the IT revolution is on. At that point of time, fund philosophy, please.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So in a sense, that wide-ranging, wide-base thinking, that's what universities are for.
And not only do that, you must do that in public institutions, because
absolutely,
access without public institutions means that it becomes, you stunt yourself, and you won't make progress over, whatever it is, over 60, 70 years. Final clip, please.
I joined nuclear physics in 1953 when I went to US. So the period of about 56 years or 60 years, it has been too full of struggle, too much full of struggle. It's true that ultimately we have succeeded, but it took too long time. And one of the reasons has been that the culture of experimental physics is not there. Somehow this caste system and Brahmanism being at the top and whatnot. Even now this religious way of thinking, which is non-objective, which is just some type of hypothetical. Because of these hurdles and my mind being tuned to experimental physics, the menu came and then neglected her. So it was a part of that.
So I thought for me this was one of the most brilliant pieces of the film. In a sense, you see the full life of a remarkable scientist who's really, like you said, he struggled to make this possible, and reflecting on the kind of forces that sort of took him to where he did, going to Rochester, bring this thing back, etc. And you know that still persists in Indian science and laboratories. The battle between, in a sense, let's say, faith and objectivity. And it's an ongoing, conversation that's happening in different parts of the world, but very much alive in our laboratories. In fact, and the questions of caste, and there's another bit which we didn't see just now, but there's a gender element to it too. This would not have been possible without the support of his wife. She talks about that very interestingly. So you see a microcosm of how, in a sense, over 60 years, Indian science has struggled in the story of this one man, and of course everybody around him who contributed to making that happen and taking it forward. So I'm just wondering, is this how Indian science is going to continue to struggle for the next 30 or 40, 50 years? We're talking about scientific tempo. That was an initial story around the 60s and 70s that maybe drew these young people into that. And today we have so-called knowledge revolution and a sort of post-industrial society. But in a sense, the debates and challenges are not very different, especially when we're talking about public universities, state universities that are outside the elite frame in some sense.
Yeah. It's not just a microcosm, right? I mean, it's what Indian society is, and it's what Indian society enables and doesn't enable, and it's reflected, resisted, and mirrored in the laboratory as well, right? So, there is no reason why what's happening in the larger Indian context, will not play out in the Indian laboratory. I mean, science not only because science at the end of the day is a social enterprise. I mean, science is society, right? Like, I mean, it's not science and society. These are not two different things at all. I mean, scientists are at the end of the day members of our society. So they reflect and they behave like they do in society. So, it's and will we continue? I mean, at least I see no signs of, sort of significant change around us. And, and it doesn't just affect science, it affects every single thing we do, right? It affects filmmaking, it affects art, it affects the human sciences. I mean, I'm sure you see that in your work as well. There's something fundamentally, how should I put it? As a historian, I would say there is a fundamental lack of respect for manual work. There's a fundamental lack of not creating, actually, or a fundamental desire to take away room from people who do manual work. So it's not even about allowing or lack or whatever. It's taking away dignity from manual work. I mean, all of this has consequences. It has consequences for our ability to industrialize or not, consequences for our ability to move, into innovative areas or not. I mean, I won't even go into the ought to mode or whatever. I mean, this is what it is. This is what we are living with. And I mean, as Pratap Mehta says in his Burden of Democracy, the reciprocity, right? Like the lack of reciprocity in Indian society at large has consequences, and we are living with those. So, why will science be in any way exempt from those at all? I mean, that's what it is. I mean, I'm absolutely sure Tanya has more to say to this, because we've talked so much about this, and we both paid good, and I'm really again grateful that I had someone as sensitive as Tanya to work with, because to not sort of we didn't want to hold like here lives Cinderella kind of placards on these problems of Indian society, but we wanted to show it for what it is, and to kind of do it while not succumbing to some of those things that we don't appreciate in filmmaking, but also elsewhere, which is taking a more patronizing, sort of upper-handed view of, oh, look at this, oh, poor things, kind of, we knew that there was no way we were going to do that, and therefore, I mean, we struggled to make things visible in a way that we would like ourselves to be represented, right? So yeah, Tanya, I think you must say more to this, because I know we've talked so much about this.
Yes, I've just been nodding a lot while you've been talking. I mean, I've been nodding while you've been talking the whole way through, but especially in this last section. And I think this is what you're talking about, the disrespect for manual work, and the lack, the separation of intellectual and manual labor. The idea that practical work cannot be creative, cannot be intellectual work. I think this is something that I found in my own, like, parallel to doing this film, research about experimental filmmaking in India. I think that is something that is a grave lack, and there has been historically a real problem of understanding that there are certain kinds of creativity that emerge, creativity and knowledge production that emerge through practice, right? Through relationship with objects, relationship with machines. And it's just fascinating for me learning with Jahnavi about the cyclotron, because it has really transformed my understanding of the problems of experimental filmmaking in India. Like, the process of learning about this film has given me a whole extra level of understanding in terms of my own research. So I really appreciate that. But I don't know, it's one of these things that somehow feels so obvious and so everywhere that we don't talk about it, or certain people, not everybody, many people do talk about it and they're not listened to, I have to say. So certain people of certain class and caste backgrounds don't talk about these things and don't appreciate, as you said, like what profound barriers this causes. So anyway, it's also something that makes me very angry. It makes me very angry, just seeing, seeing the kind of blinkeredness of certain ways of thinking about creativity and knowledge production. Anyway, but I think I just wanted to also add to Jahnavi's point about not wanting to signpost in the film. I think we did feel strongly about that, because we also wanted to acknowledge that the lab and the process of working in the lab also does break down some of these things, right? It doesn't completely break down these barriers, but to some extent it does. And it's a complicated situation, it's a complicated relationship between people, where there is genuine camaraderie, and yet there are also hierarchy. These things, they coexist.
Yes.
And we wanted to just allow that to be visible. And perhaps it's visible, maybe it's less visible to people who are very removed from the situation. So, I mean, I would be curious to know how much the sort of commentary on caste and technical labor and social hierarchies and gender are clear to non-Indians or people who don't. I mean, I'm not sure. I feel like there's a kind of very subtle comments that we're making, and maybe some people pick up on them and other people don't.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I mean, it really was a pleasure to see this because they're subtle, but for those of us who have eyes and ears, I guess, you can see them. And I think, in some senses, if you're making a film on a similar kind of a film or film around similar themes in other contexts, including in North America at the current point of time, where there's a lot of contest on these questions, I think you'd find similar kind of hierarchies. But thank you so much. I think the film has given us a lot of insight into things that you would imagine to be very clinical and whatever. That's at least the popular imagination, both of science as it plays itself out, and also science as it's constructed in sort of mainstream media. We have a whole genre of new films about India's great science and technology and space and this and that and the other. And just the contrast between the reality and the experienced and the lived reality that you see here, and what's constructed. Is so stark. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure watching the film, learning from you, and learning about how you sort of help not only research this but actually construct this. But I'll hand it over now to Subhashri. I'm sure there are lots of questions that people have. And so
yeah, I mean, there are quite a few questions actually. Thank you for this wonderful discussion. I mean, as I was thinking to myself, I come from a liberal arts background, and my high point of knowing about science and popular culture is reading Richard Feynman's books. So that's where it begins and ends. So this is perhaps a different kind of journey that will start after this film. I'm going to go to the questions. There are quite a few. The first one is from Radha Mohini Prasad. Congratulations on an unusual and interesting film. Apart from its scientific historical interest, it also gestures to a certain resourceful spirit present in the country, sometimes called jugaad, and I suppose that's a term we've used even in the discussion, and a determination to improvise with what is available. This seems to span a large distance between scrapyards and laboratories and reminds us of the CDAC supercomputer, ingeniously devised by Indian scientists back in the 90s when the US denied the Cray computers needed for nuclear research. Jahnavi, this question is to you. As a historian, as a science historian, would you like to comment on this?
So yeah, I mean, I must say, I really don't like the word jugaad. But that's a discussion for another time. But that having said, I mean, I understand the sentiment behind, I understand the analysis behind it. And I know you, of course, also very carefully say sometimes called jugaad. So, so, I mean, I think resourceful spirit, I mean, cyclotronians the world round were resourceful people, right? Like, I mean, they used, for example, even in the US, the magnets, right? Like you needed magnets of several tons. And they used magnets from the Federal Telegraph and, built these cyclotrons. So resourcefulness and science and labs in science and engineering, I mean, again, Aro will be, able to speak more to this than even I can. Because, this is done everywhere, right? I mean, it's increasingly done less, but it's done everywhere. But on the other hand, the story that you mentioned of the CDAC supercomputer or super solver, not super solver, flow solver of the late 80s at the National Aeronautics Lab, for example, again, because the Indians were denied Cray computers, I mean, that's it makes you wonder then. So okay, so we didn't have access to the Cray, and so we built these. So what was stopping us from actually, and by us I don't mean, as a historian, I'm really sort of trying to distance myself from this and say that so what stopped scientists in India or engineers in India from building these computers before? Right? Like, so, it's not that the information is not available. I mean, and in that sense, the cyclotronians of India were actually fairly early out. And, the Chandigarh story is, of course, a very, very specific one, but Indian cyclotronians were early out. Why? What's stopping us from doing things that we know are possible? And it's in these areas that we don't, right? Theoretical questions we pick up very quickly and we run very fast with them, but we don't pick up experimental questions. And so what stops us? Why are our processes not geared towards allowing this stuff to happen? Or are we using those as a smokescreen? What's happening? And I think we need more research into it, and we need a more honest discussion on it. I mean, it's not like a historian will have answers to it, or anybody for that matter, but I think we need an open and honest discussion about what drives people in labs, and why what gets done, and why what doesn't get done.
There's another question from someone called Shubham Sengupta. The question is there an increasing culture of women participating in fields of nuclear and experimental physics in India, or is the gender ratio still fairly skewed?
On an average, I think the gender ratio is still in the physical sciences and engineering still skewed in favor of more men or male candidates than female candidates. That's not the case in biology, for example, or medicine or biotech for that matter. But again, I mean, it's also about what stage of education you're talking about. In the university, you often see more female students, and then by the time it comes to actually having careers, then many of them are simply missing. So,
right.
Yeah, but I mean, on an average, it would be safe to assume it's skewed. There's just no doubt about that.
Right. There's a question by someone who's identified themselves as anonymous attendee, who asked this question, which I think is interesting, right? And I think your film to some extent speaks to that, is what is the space for oral histories and memory in the history of science itself? It's a broad question, but do you want to think about that? Because your film somewhere is sort of gesturing in that direction. There's something you're doing. So if you wanted to, you've spoken about it, but if you would like to add more.
So I think for that, we should just remember that beautiful clip that Tanya put together, right? Like the beam came in 76, and then it came in 77, and then it came in 78, right?
Yeah.
And I think that for me is that nails it.
Exactly.
And that nails the difference between history and memory.
Correct.
Which is not to say that there's no value for memory, because memory serves incredible psychosocial function, and history serves, again, a social and intellectual function. So they both have their place, but we should not mistake memory for history. So this is a film that has taken a historical event, a historical machine, but it speaks from and to the memory of the people who have kept it running, for whom I have the greatest respect. And I mean, we are also embarking on a project called Recollect India, which is to collect oral histories of Free India's first generation of scientists, engineers and lab technicians. So, I mean, I see the value in it, but I will not mistake memory for history.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, and that's a complex thing, right? Because I feel like sometimes memory, even though it's unstable, can go to places where history cannot go and will never go. So it's not an either or. Totally.
I mean, we've seen that in your own filmmaking, right? Like where it's the memories of the people of a particular event that happened in history. So the Nelly massacre, for example.
Right.
And as I said, I mean, it serves a psychosocial function, and it's incredibly important because it can relieve, it can agonize, it can traumatize, it does a range of things. So, so there's no ignoring it, and it's very, very important, but don't sort of, mix the two.
Right. There's a question from one Mohit Yadav. So it goes, my first question is, what are the big challenges of creating science museum? And the second question, especially for Jahnavi, how do you see the research culture in India historically and in present scenario? I think that's been kind of, you've dealt with that question, but I mean, if you want to take it, yeah.
That's a big question. I mean, that's like two massive questions. How do I see research culture in India historically and present scenario? I think present is like elsewhere, actually, more regimented around specializations, more narrow, more outward looking, even more outward looking than before. And we have even sort of, and we have a smaller number of islands of excellence and a larger sort of vast desert of underfunded people wanting to do science and struggling. Whereas if you look at earlier, like the earlier 20th century, so I'm a 20th century historian. I don't sort of think, I'm not able to think properly about periods before late 19th century. So if you look at the early 20th century, I think it was far more open. Like my favorite story is about the accountant Raman working at the Indian Association for Cultivation of Science for 10 years and doing research. He was an accountant. He could do things. Today, you can't do that anymore. So it was far more open. people had multiple identities. I mean, J.C. Bose was, he wrote science fiction stories, he wrote mad stories. He researched on plants, he researched microwaves. I mean, even as we know, before Marconi. He did a range of things. Prafulla Chandra Rai, who ran Bengal Chemicals and was a chemist as well and did other things. Satyen Bose was a sarod player. No, was he sarod or veena player, and did a range of things. Raman also was an accomplished musician, and he did research both in acoustics and optics. We don't have that anymore, right? And again, this is not typical only to India, but it's in some ways it's actually even more restricted in India than elsewhere, right? Because we take it and we kind of go like that. So there's less mobility. There's less interest in things beyond the natural sciences. So I mean, Raman collected things, for example, right? Like, I mean, so those of you who have the opportunity to go see the museum at the Raman Research Institute in Bangalore, you can go see. He collected stones, and including precious stones. He had a collection of musical instruments. Similarly, several things that J.C. Bose did or whatever. So yeah, so more open, wider interests, and multiple identities, accounting this, businessman, scientist, etc. So less of that happening. I mean, even in the mid 20th century, if you look at Sarabhai, for example, right? Like, I mean, he had an industrial family, and he also looked after the industrial interests of the family, and also did science, and he was a cosmic ray physicist, and then he also became a space scientist. Similarly, which we see very, 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 very less of. So it's less a vocation now and more a profession.
Right. Thank you. There are a couple more questions, I think, but they've already been discussed about the cyclotron, and I think we've taken all the others. We're running out of time, so we will have to close this now. I always feel like the school teacher who's like, okay, let's wrap up. So thank you so much, Jahnavi. Thank you so much, Tanya, and thank you, Aromar, for this wonderful discussion. But since you're all here, I'm going to take a few minutes more of your time and say that we are not going to have a monthly screening next month, because we have the Urban Lens Film Festival, which is on from the 1st to 6th December. And this year, we've gone online because you all know why. There is a pandemic raging. So I would really request all of you here to come attend the festival. One of my colleagues will share the registration link for you to register. Do share it widely. There's a whole range of films from India and some 17 countries. There are master classes. I promise you it will be very, very, very engaging. And before we leave, we'll just play out the trailer, which is for a minute and 10 seconds, and then we will let you go. Can we just have the Urban Lens trailer, please? All right. Thank you so much. So see you all soon. And Jahnavi, all the very best. Hope to see many more films made by you. And all the best for Science Gallery, and to you too, Tanya, for your PhD and all other works that you part of. Thank you all. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Subhashri. Thank you, Aro.
Bye.
And thanks, Tanya.